So viewers, welcome to Japan. It's now October and time when all the mud pond harvests are taking place. Now I figured it was time to start with a series of articles about mud ponds, mud pond water and Japanese fish houses, basically all of those topics that encompass the raising of nishikigoi. So here we have the mud pond, and from many years ago the mud pond was regarded as being something magical or mythical that raised koi in such a way that no other environment could. And in reality that's not really the case, because for instance in this pond's case there's about 20 fish in this mud pond. If you were going to raise those koi in a concrete filtered mud pond, the running cost would be pretty much colossal. And I can't argue with the fact that the water in this mud pond is fantastic for raising koi. It's incredibly soft, and although it's green, and you would be forgiven for thinking that the pH swings and the pH is high, that's actually not the case. And what I'll cover today is a series of water tests on water from the mud pond, and we will talk about why the mud pond does what it does. And this is going to take a few videos to cover, but today we'll start with the basic water chemistry. But the main benefit really of ponds like this is that the running costs are extremely low. You've got a Japanese climate that will give you a temperature of, let's say, 23, 4, 5 degrees during the summer months. You've got the turbidity of the water there that allows the fish a lot of protection from the sunlight when the sun is really strong in the high point of the day. Consequently, you'll find that early in the morning the fish will be up near the surface looking for food. When the sun gets strong, the fish can feel that strength of the sun and they can get down deeper to get away from it. And then later on in the afternoon, evening, when the sun starts going down, the fish then start coming up to the surface again looking for food again. The fish aren't The fish aren't stupid. The fish know when the sun is getting too intense, when it will cause colour damage. And water like this, with this turbidity, makes this environment quite forgiving on the koi. It allows the koi to see enough sunlight to keep the colour flourishing and shiny, but enough protection that if it's too strong, they can go down and they can get away from that sunlight. So this is a very forgiving environment, and that environment is really hard to replicate in a concrete pond. And so there are advantages and disadvantages. But like I say, first off, we will start with the water chemistry in the mud pond and talk about that. And so right now it's time to go off and get a water sample, and we will come back in a minute and talk some more. So I've now managed to survive the ordeal of going down and getting a bottle of Japan's finest. So here we have some slightly turbid mud pond water. So with no further ado, I will take you guys over to the laboratory, which is over here somewhere. Right, let's go over there. So here we have our Palin Test 8000. So first up is the pH test. So we'll start with the basics. I do have an awful lot of parameters for testing water, but I don't really see too much mileage in using those, because for the most part the levels of various metals and minerals and that kind of thing are so small that they are almost immeasurable. So we would do the basic ones like pH, alkalinity, hardness, and then how much actual calcium there is in there. And that, I think, will be about it really for today. So basically I'm right now mixing the actual tablet. So so we can get our first reading. So first off, we blanket with a clear sample. Now this is so that the meter itself can zero its colours against the basic water sample without any reagents. So that's now blanked. And then we take our sample with the reagent and pop that in there. Put the cover on. So there we have it. We've got a pH of 7.03, and this is at, it is now approximately 11, actually no it's not, 12 o'clock, it's just turned 12 o'clock, and it's a very strong sunny day, and you can see here that despite the water being somewhat green in colour, its pH is actually very neutral, 7.03. So that kind of, if you like, dispels the idea that the pH in the mud pond runs high because of the algae, and dispels that myth that the pH actually swings, which in actual fact it doesn't. pH on the mud ponds typically will run anywhere between say 6.8 and 7.1, 7.2, but more than likely most mud pond waters will test out very, very close on 7.0. Sometimes during the rainy season the pH can be adversely affected, can be basically pulled down and made acidic by the rainfall during the rainy season, and consequently during rainy season sometimes breeders will panic and they will be out there trying to buffer up the pH on the water on fry ponds and such like, because of fear of the pH crashing. But in all fairness, in this area it's not something that I'd seen happen. I've not seen anyone have that necessity of running out and buffering it up. But anyway, 7.03 is where our pH is. So next up is alkalinity. So I've measured out our sample, and we'll now add an alkalinity tablet to it. Now, that's the clear sample calibrated. And now for, zoom out again a little bit. Right, now for our water sample, pop that in, put the cover on, and the moment of truth. Let's find out how much KH is in this mud pond water. So there we have it, 24 milligrams a litre. So it's about 1 and a little bit of KH in this water. Now one thing that is worthy of noting is that right now this pond is being prepared for harvesting. So these readings aren't what you would typically expect. Ordinarily, when the ponds are being fed, the pH will still tend to be around about the same, but the alkalinity will usually be slightly lower. But because the temperature now are dropping and the feeding has been stopped to prepare for harvesting, the pH will usually rise very slightly, and the KH also will rise very slightly because of the lack of acidic loading on the pond, because of basically fish waste byproducts from the filtration process that's going on within the mud pond itself, pulling that pH down and burning up the KH. So there we've got it, 24 milligrams a litre, so just over 1 degree of KH. Now next up we will do hardness and then calcium. So bear with me, I'll put this on pause and we will resume in a second. So I can't for some reason find our total hardness reagent. I've got rather a lot of reagents, a lot of parameters, and for some reason that one's not here. So with no further ado, we will go on to calcium hardness. Now calcium hardness in the mud pond, or in any pond for that matter, will be a lot more abundant than anything else anyway. So if you are looking at total hardness and components within that total hardness, calcium will always rank the highest within that sample. And the reason basically being predominantly is that the fish food itself, one of the most abundant elements within it is actually calcium. So any fish waste byproducts or undigested food will basically raise the hardness level. Now, fish waste byproducts are actually the thing that will raise it the most, because what is contained within the food that's most abundant is calcium as an element, and consequently the fish waste itself, once it breaks down, will add to the GH levels rather a lot. And if you actually test the water sample of a pond, you will find that almost all of what's in that sample will be calcium rather than magnesium or anything else. So I was going to do a total hardness test followed by calcium, but for some reason I can't seem to find the hardness test tablets. Now, I do have rather a lot of test reagents, quite an extensive array of parameters, but for some reason the water's hardness one itself, total hardness, isn't here. So instead of doing that, we will abandon that test, skip it, and go on with calcium instead. Now this test needs a 2-minute standing time before it can actually be read, so we can use that to just waffle for a moment. Now, calcium within itself, within the koi environment, and the most abundant thing you'll find within the GH level or total hardness is actually calcium ions. And the reason for that being is that the fish food itself, the most abundant element within that food is actually calcium. So if you look at not the actual ingredient list as such, but the analysis of food, you'll find calcium is the most abundant thing in there. So when you're testing GH levels on a pond to see whether your GH levels are rising, which they will in any pond, if you then go specifically into elements of that hardness to see what it's constituted of or made up of, you'll find that it is predominantly calcium. Second to that will be magnesium, but the magnesium is just a tiny fraction of what the calcium is within that test result, so it's almost not really worth testing. But the calcium levels itself within any pond, be it a mud pond or be it a concrete filtered pond, a hobbyist pond, will basically rise and add to the GH levels as a byproduct of fish waste. So what you have is that the food that is fed to the fish will result in waste coming out of the other end of the fish. Now, calcium itself is the most abundant element within the food, and consequently there's a lot more in there than what the fish can actually utilise. At this point I'll just put this blanking sample in and blank this one. So because they can't utilise it, they're excreting the calcium out, and that calcium that's in that fish waste, when the fish waste itself breaks down, will add to the GH level in the pond. And that's the reason why you'll find that on a koi pond that's heavily fed, you'll find that the GH level will always be significantly higher than the fresh water that is used to fill the pond or top up the pond. Consequently, those levels do need to be maintained and kept in check, because they will continue to rise, as will the TDS. And the TDS itself will give you a reasonable indication of whether the water in your pond is actually being changed enough, because if that differential between the new water going into the pond and the pond itself is too high, then it's basically an indication that you're not doing enough maintenance on the pond. So anyway, I'm sure now we've elapsed our 2 minutes for doing this sample, so with no further ado, let's just give that tube a quick dry off, pop that one in there, put our cap on and we will see how much calcium hardness we've got. Oh, 0. But that's that then. So there is 0 kH in this mud pond, or at least 0 calcium. Now if the calcium level is 0, you can pretty much guarantee that the magnesium level, which is the next main factor within that GH, will also be 0, because it's always going to be a small fraction of what the calcium level would be by comparison. So it's fair to say that if I had my GH test kit reagent here and ran the GH test, it would come out at 0 or possibly 1 or 2 milligrams a litre at most. So if you're asking yourself whether fish need minerals in the mud pond, whether they need calcium and magnesium, I think this pretty much tells you that they don't. So basically fish derive all of their mineral requirements from the fish food itself. That's why fish food itself is very rich in calcium and magnesium levels. Now also what's going on in the mud pond environment is you do have the mud in the bottom of the pond itself, and you will have some freshwater shrimps and things like that, other insect life that lives in the bottom of there that the fish can forage around and eat. So that does substitute their diet to a large part. Now they are freshwater shrimps, not the kind of, they're not prawns or anything like that. You'll get some crayfish in ponds as well sometimes, but shrimps are relatively common. And fish will eat the shrimps to some point. So they will get some calcium from that. But nonetheless, looking at the water that's in the pond, it's fair to say that the mineral content of mud pond water is incredibly low. Now, one thing I should do here at this point to basically back up all of this is to test the TDS level on the pond. Now that meter's the wrong one, that's a pH and TDS. Let me just see, check the car. Okay, so we now have our TDS meter. So let's take a quick look. Alright, so I now have our TDS and conductivity tester. So let's just take a quick look at where we are with our TDS levels. So here we are. If you can see that, I need to check that actually is visible. We have a TDS level on this mud pond of, it's about 25 parts per million TDS. So that TDS level basically constitutes everything that is dissolved in that water. So you've got your calcium, magnesium, your alkalinity, everything is contained within that reading. Now, the reason why the TDS level doesn't necessarily in parts per million or milligrams per litre relate directly to, let's say, calcium hardness is because calcium hardness is measured with the assumption that it is linked as a component of calcium carbonate. So it's not just whilst the calcium test is measuring for calcium ions, it is actually making that assumption as a unit of measurement that is attached to a carbonate ion. So it's a calcium carbonate reading. Likewise, if you do an alkalinity test, that's also measured as being an assumption that it's linked as calcium carbonate and measured as milligrams a litre of calcium carbonate. So if you can't just add the two figures together. So if you get, like, let's say, a GH of 20 parts per million and a KH of 20 parts per million, that doesn't mean you're going to get a TDS of 40 plus all the other things that are in there, because you've got a calcium side of it for your GH, and then you've got your carbonate side for the alkalinity, which is also part of that calcium carbonate. So theoretically, at least, you could still get a level of 20, even though you've got a calcium hardness of 20 and an alkalinity of 20. You can still show 20 milligrams a litre. So it's all a bit complex. because there are an awful lot of links with various elements within the water in that way. So whilst TDS will give you a total ion count, it is literally, I mean, it's measuring everything, but it's quite a complex subject in itself. So yeah, 25 parts per million of TDS. So anybody that tells you that fish need minerals and things like that, well, I think it's not the case. Now, one thing that I saw discussed the other day recently was about hard water and reverse osmosis, the use of it, causing lack of sumi development. Now, frankly, that's not something I've found myself. I think water quality itself has a huge bearing on sumi development. So hard water, I think, doesn't really increase sumi development of koi. What hard water, I think, does do is maybe it helps for lower quality sumi to come up more. But in actual fact, what I find over the years, what I've found is that water quality itself is more responsible for sumi development. So if you've got fantastic water quality, then it's possible to get really beautiful sumi. But I think if the water is of poor quality, let's say the pH is really high, and maybe the water is just not as good as it could be, I think that actually destroys a lot of the shine in sumi, and it makes the sumi more kage looking. I think if the water is really, really beautiful, sumi can develop. And even in the mud pond, sumi comes up, whether it's suri or whether it's showa or sanki. You don't see fish come out in the mud pond with the sumi suddenly having disappeared. The only reason it will really disappear is probably because the quality of the sumi in the first place wasn't so good, and that water just kind of allowed it to go down. But really high quality sumi, you will find that when you pull the fish out of the mud pond, the fish will actually come out with development rather than retarded development. So I don't think it's necessary to try to manipulate your water to try to make sumi look better on fish or come up more on fish. I really don't think that's the case. Anyway, for now, I think that's enough testing for the moment. I will come back and do more tests and cover more on water in that regard later. But I'm kind of running out of time now for what I can do movie-wise. So I should call it a day for a minute. Anyway, as you can see, I do have rather a large, extensive amount of test kits. So you've got or reagents, should I say, in the box there. There's all the usual ones: ammonia, nitrate, chlorine, which obviously you don't need when it comes to mud ponds or borehole water, along with various other metals. And then we've got phosphate, zinc, potassium, magnesium, silica, all those kind of things. So this is something I've been looking at over the years rather extensively in regards to mud ponds, borehole water in Japan, hobbyist ponds in Japan and such like. And for me it's an interesting subject, but it's also, I guess, in many ways quite a daunting one. But it's a fascinating one nonetheless, because one thing that I've learned over the years by using all these various water tests is from looking at various different hobbyist ponds and breeders ponds and things like that, and trying to compile all of the data and make sense of it is really rather fascinating, because you can always establish links between... Yeah, the camera's moving all on its own. Let's move this thing back up. Let's move it up some more. Okay. Yeah, one thing that I've found fascinating with all the water testing over the years, there's one other piece of equipment I've got incidentally, which is a continuous measuring unit, which is ion specific, and that will measure pH, and it will also measure conductivity, ORP, and temperature and oxygen levels. But that machine is particularly good for doing monitoring and data logging on ponds. So that's been invaluable in itself as like a research tool, if you like, because with that piece of equipment you can check how the pond is performing in a 24-hour period or day-by-day period. So rather than just checking, let's say, pH or oxygen levels in the morning and then testing maybe in the evening, you'll know exactly what's going on 24 hours a day. So you can that machine will data log and give you readings every 10 minutes of all the parameters that you've selected. So it is particularly useful. But one thing I have found really fascinating with all of this equipment over the years, having brought it to Japan and also having looked at hobbyist ponds in the UK and even in Europe, I've taken it over to there as well, is that you can establish a lot of links between different kinds of water, different elements and different ponds. And that's where it's all proved particularly invaluable to me, is looking at hobbyist ponds around the UK and in different geological areas really within the UK has been fascinating. So the one thing I found years ago, having done a lot of pond visits to customers' ponds, and that was the thing that got me, say 20 years or so ago, really interested in water, was that basically some people could grow fish really well and other people couldn't. And all of it really turned out to be coming down to water, chemistry in itself, and the sort of geological ground that the water was tracking through before it found its way into reservoirs and consequently into people's water supplies that were used for topping up the ponds. And one common thing that I found was over in Wales, the water is really soft, people could grow fish. Down in Cornwall, Devon and Cornwall, people could grow fish really well. And up north as well, people could grow fish really well. But in Bristol area, where I'm originally from, people just couldn't. And I myself couldn't. And I did everything that I could back in the day to get koi to grow back in the 90s. And it would just never work. And when I started coming to Japan, in actual fact, it started all before that. 1998 is when everything all started. And I started looking at water and why fish grew in some ponds, not in others, and so on. Now, consequently, it's led me down a very interesting road, because basically anyone that's got soft water and a lower pH and lower TDS will inevitably get better results with both growth and condition of the koi compared to those people that are in hard water areas. And that was really the sort of common and most simple way of putting it all, the common link between all of those different ponds and different areas. Now, coming to Japan and doing a lot of testing with this equipment in Japan, basically I found that it was the same thing. If you looked at Wales water and the more sort of northern and also Cornish water was a lot more similar to the water in Japan itself. Now, Japan itself is very volcanic. Some areas more than others, like down in Kyushu, it's particularly more volcanic than around this area. So you'll find that things like zinc and iron is a little bit more abundant in Kyushu than it is in this area. But basically, a lot of the ground that the water's tracking through in this area is like granite or granite basalt. And basically, it doesn't pick any hardness levels up in the water. So if you look at borehole water in this area, which consequently is what's filling these particular mud ponds here, the water in this particular area is coming out of the borehole at less than 20 milligrams a litre of TDS levels. And the borehole that we have at Yume, Japan, is actually giving water with about 43 ppm of TDS, which is also extremely low. And the water is extremely soft, not as soft as here. But basically, wherever you go within Japan itself, you'll find that the hardness levels are particularly low compared to the UK or possibly America. I don't know how America is, but Japan's water, I think because of its volcanic structure on the geology, is particularly soft. And so, yeah, I mean, it is particularly fascinating to me. But that, like I say, borehole supplies, wherever you go within Japan, the mud ponds themselves are either filled, let's say in Niigata, with snow coming down off the mountains that do the initial fills over winter on mud ponds, which basically is the softest way of all, or spring water. So a lot of ponds are spring water fed or otherwise borehole fed. So wherever you go, you'll find the same thing, whether it's drinking water, whether it's mud pond water, borehole water. You'll find the same thing, that wherever you go in Japan, the water is incredibly soft, but different levels of incredibly softness. So anyway, that concludes it all for today. I will bring you another episode soon, hopefully in the next few days, but I've got a few harvest videos that I need to edit and get those uploaded. But I hope you've enjoyed this video. If you've enjoyed it, please by all means recommend it to your friends or subscribe to it for updates of when we upload new videos. And leave any comments as well if you feel so inclined, because feedback really is what I need for what we're doing here. So if there's some kind of topic that you would like covering, then I'll do my best to cover that topic, or to find people that perhaps can give me the information for that topic if it's something that I don't know. So anyway, thanks for watching and goodbye.